They found the first cub in a ditch, shivering and too weak to lift its head. By nightfall, there were 3, each one orphaned, their cries breaking the quiet of the valley. No one expected an old shepherd dog to step forward, nose to nose, and claim them as her own. She guarded them like shadows, fed them, warmed them, taught them the language of safety. For months, they were a strange family, wild and tame, bound by something deeper than blood. But the wild never forgets its own, and the day came when it came calling for them. What happened next would leave the entire town silent. Before we start, make sure you've subscribed so you don't miss the next unbelievable wildlife story, because what you're about to see will stay with you forever. The first light over Pine Hollow came in fragments, thin slivers of gold threading between the dark silhouettes of the pines, catching in the morning mist that clung low over the pasture. Jacob Marlowe stood on the porch of his weathered ranch house, one hand wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee, the other resting on the railing worn smooth by years of habit. The air smelled of pine resin and cold earth. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a raven croaked once, then fell silent. It was the kind of morning that usually carried no surprises. Out here, most days began like this, quiet, deliberate, unhurried. Rowan, his 9-year-old shepherd mix, lay sprawled at the top of the porch steps, her thick coat catching the pale light. Her ears twitched occasionally at distant sounds, but her eyes stayed half-closed. She was a steady presence, the kind of dog that didn't chase after every rustle or shadow. That's why, when she suddenly lifted her head and fixed her gaze on the far edge of the field, Jacob noticed. At first, he thought she was tracking a deer. But Rowan didn't stiffen in the way she usually did when prey passed close. There was no growl, no tense readiness to charge. Instead, she rose slowly, nose lifted to catch a scent, her tail low but moving faintly, almost uncertainly. Jacob followed her line of sight. About 30 yards out, just where the pasture met the first line of undergrowth, something shifted, 3 small shapes huddled together, barely visible through the veil of mist. He squinted. Cats maybe. Strays from the next valley over? But as Rowan moved down the steps, her paws soundless on the damp wood, Jacob saw the details. Short, stubby tails, tufts of black-tipped fur on their ears, paws far too large for their thin frames. Their coats were patterned with faint spots, the kind that caught the light in broken patches. Bobcats. The 3 of them pressed close, their bodies trembling in the chill. The one in the middle lifted its head briefly at Rowan's approach, revealing eyes the pale, impossible green of deep forest water. Jacob felt something inside him pull tight. Then he saw what lay 10 feet behind them. It was the body of an adult bobcat, larger, heavier, her coat dulled not by age but by death. One hind leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and around the ankle, glinting faintly in the rising sun, was a steel snare. Jacob stopped cold. The air seemed thinner suddenly, harder to pull into his lungs. The trapper's work. Illegal on this side of the ridge, but that didn't stop the ones who came at night. Rowan had reached the cubs now, her head lowered, her ears pitched forward in concern rather than threat. She gave a low whine, not sharp, but soft, almost coaxing. The smallest cub, little more than skin and bones, let out a rasping cry. Against every instinct, it crawled toward her, dragging its belly through the damp grass until it pressed against the thick fur of her foreleg. Jacob knew enough about wildlife to understand what he was seeing, a moment when instinct could tilt either way. The cub might bolt, or Rowan might decide it was a threat. But neither happened. Instead, Rowan lowered her head and breathed warm air across the tiny face, as if memorizing its scent. The other 2 cubs didn't follow immediately. One lifted a paw and swiped half-heartedly at Rowan's muzzle. The other stayed rigid, its gaze darting between Jacob and the lifeless body of its mother. Jacob's throat felt tight. He had rules about this sort of thing. You didn't intervene unless absolutely necessary. Nature had its own laws, and most of the time, human meddling only made things worse. But this wasn't nature's doing. He crouched slowly, careful not to startle them, and called softly to Rowan. She glanced back, tail giving one low sweep before she returned her gaze to the cubs. The mist was lifting now, and Jacob could see them more clearly. Their fur was matted with damp, and their thin sides rose and fell too quickly. Hunger, cold, fear, he recognized all of it in the way they clung together. A sharp gust of wind came down from the ridge, and the smallest cub shivered so violently Jacob felt it in his own bones. That decided it. He moved forward, each step slow, his boots making almost no sound on the softened earth. The cubs flinched but didn't run, their exhaustion outweighing their instinct to flee. Rowan gave another soft whine and stepped back just enough to let Jacob close the gap. When he was close enough, he extended a hand, not to grab, but to let them scent him. The smallest cub leaned fractionally toward him, then collapsed against Rowan's side again. Jacob let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Somewhere above them, the first full light of morning spilled over the treetops, bathing the scene in a muted gold. The still form of the mother lay quiet under its shroud of dew. The three cubs huddled together, one pressed to the warmth of a domestic dog who should have been their enemy, but somehow wasn't. And Jacob, standing over them, knew the quiet of Pine Hollow had just changed. What waited in the coming weeks was unknown, and maybe impossible, but in that moment, the choice was already made. He would not leave them here. The first true test came in late autumn. The days shortened quickly in Cedar Ridge, the light retreating earlier each evening, leaving the forest in a bruise-colored haze. Mark could sense the change before the animals did. Every year, the shift in season brought different scents, new risks. For the three bobcat cubs, still lean, still learning, their boundaries were widening. They had begun slipping further from the cabin, following scents down deer trails and along the edges of the frozen creek. It worried him more than he wanted to admit. One morning, just after dawn, Mark found only two of the cubs near the porch. He scanned the slope below, whistling the short, sharp call they recognized. The wind answered with nothing but the creak of trees. He grabbed his jacket, boots crunching in the frost, and followed the prints downhill. He found the missing cub tangled in an old barbed wire fence, panting in panic. The wire had cut into its back leg, fur clotted with blood. Mark's stomach knotted. This was the world beyond their safe circle, the one that didn't care about affection or loyalty. It took him almost 20 minutes to free the animal. His gloves were shredded, his hands nicked, but the cub collapsed against him when it was finally loose, trembling. He carried it all the way back to the cabin, the other two bobcats pacing alongside, their tails twitching. Inside, Daisy took over. The dog had learned, in her own quiet way, to sense the cub's distress. She nosed at the injured leg, then lay beside the animal while Mark cleaned and bandaged it. It wasn't just the wound, it was the lesson. The forest was starting to demand its toll. That night, Mark sat by the wood stove with all four of them, the dog's head resting on his knee, the cubs curled close. He knew this couldn't last forever. They were growing fast, the muscle definition sharper each week, their instincts pulling them toward independence. But there was a strange peace in those moments. The storm outside rattled the windows, yet inside the room, there was warmth, breath, and quiet companionship. The peace didn't last. 2 weeks later, a fresh snowfall revealed something Mark had dreaded. New tracks circling the property. Not deer, not fox. These were larger. He followed them far enough to confirm what his gut already told him. An adult male bobcat had come close. Mark knew enough about wild cats to understand what that meant. The cubs were no longer invisible to the wider wilderness. A wild male might tolerate them, or he might not. In the following days, the cubs grew restless, especially at night. They would stand by the door, ears pivoting toward the tree line, listening to something Mark couldn't hear. Daisy would watch them with a low, uneasy whine. And then came the night that changed everything. It was after midnight, the moon hidden behind clouds. Mark woke to Daisy's bark, sharp, urgent. He threw on his coat and stepped outside, flashlight in hand. The beam caught the glint of eyes at the edge of the property, 4 of them. 2 belonged to one of his cubs. The other, he had never seen before. The wild male stood frozen, muscles tense. The cub didn't move, torn between the familiar light behind it and the silent pull of the wild in front. The air felt electric. Mark knew if he stepped forward too quickly, he might scare them both into the dark. If he did nothing, the wild might win. The cub's head turned toward him for just a moment, eyes wide and uncertain. That was all the time he had to decide. And in that moment, Mark realized something. The forest wasn't here to take them from him. It was here to remind him they were never his to keep. What he did next would determine whether this story ended in loss or in trust. By the time the cubs were nearly a year old, they had transformed into something unrecognizable from the helpless bundles Owen had carried into his home. Their legs had grown long and powerful, shoulders thickened with muscle, their spots fading into the muted, mottled coats of young hunters. The dog, Rhea, still moved among them with the same slow patience she had when they were tiny, her broad head dipping as she groomed their ears, her tail wagging in small, cautious arcs. But something had shifted. It started with the mornings. Where once the Bobcats would tumble into the kitchen at the sound of the kettle boiling, they now lingered near the edge of the woods. They'd crouch there in the pale light, eyes fixed on something Owen couldn't see. Their ears twitched toward the rustle of small bodies in the underbrush, the distant call of a jay. And sometimes, though they always returned, they would vanish for hours. Owen knew this day would come. He had read about it, braced for it. Still, watching them leave and come back again, each time a little more restless, felt like watching someone slowly roll up the rug from under his feet. One evening, after a rainless summer day that left the air tasting like dust, Owen stepped outside to find Rhea standing alone by the fence line. Her chest rose and fell faster than normal, and her eyes kept flicking toward the field beyond the yard. No cubs, just silence. They'll be back, he told her. His own voice sounded foreign, too flat, too certain. He turned and went back inside, but he didn't light the lamps. He waited in the dark. The minutes stretched until they became hours, until he found himself at the threshold again, staring into the black space where the cubs should have been. When they finally returned, it was just after midnight. All three slipped through the shadows, their paws soundless on the packed dirt. The middle cub carried something limp in its jaws, a rabbit, its fur still damp with blood. Owen's breath caught. They didn't drop it at his feet like they once might have. They carried it past him, toward the far corner of the yard, and ate under the dark branches of the oak. Rhea padded toward them, her tail low. She sniffed the air, then gave a low chuff and sat nearby, watching. Owen saw it then, not hostility, not rejection, but the beginnings of a quiet detachment. She knew they were changing. In the days that followed, the yard became a place of arrivals and departures. The cubs would lounge with Rhea in the morning, batting lazily at her ears, then vanish by midday. Sometimes they came back scratched, their fur full of burrs, their eyes brighter in that way the wild makes them. Owen tried to keep himself busy, mending the porch rail, fixing the gutter, tightening the fence, but every sound from the woods made him glance up. Then came the morning that made his stomach turn to stone. He was pouring coffee when Rhea bolted upright from her spot by the door, ears pricked. Owen stepped onto the porch just in time to see two of the cubs slip out of the tree line, moving fast, their bodies low. The third wasn't with them. He waited. The seconds dragged into minutes, minutes into an hour. Nothing. Rhea paced the yard, whining softly, her nails scraping the packed earth. Owen walked the edge of the property, calling into the trees until his throat ached. No answer, just the deep, indifferent hum of the forest. It was nearly sunset when the missing cub reappeared. Owen saw him first, emerging from the shadows with a limp that made Owen's knees weaken. His left shoulder was matted with dried blood. His flanks heaved with every step. Rhea rushed forward, circling him, licking his face, pressing her head into his side. The other cubs hovered near, tails flicking nervously. Owen crouched, his hands hovering in the air before he finally touched the injury. The wound was deep, a long, jagged tear across the shoulder. He didn't know what had caused it, but the edges looked like claws. Bigger. The summer air hung thick over the valley, heavy with the scent of sagebrush and dust. The ranch had fallen quieter than it had been in years. No playful growls, no quick footfalls in the grass. Just the low hum of insects and the occasional call of a red-tailed hawk somewhere high above. Ethan stood at the edge of the pasture, hands buried deep in his pockets, staring at the line of hills that rose like a faded painting against the horizon. He knew they were out there, alive, somewhere in the wild. He told himself that every day. Still, the silence of their absence was a wound that didn't close. It had been 6 months since the Bobcats had gone back to the mountains. 6 months since Ethan had last seen those fierce, golden eyes looking at him from the shadow of the cottonwoods. And in that time, he had rebuilt the ranch fence, fixed the barn roof, and tended to the dogs, but there were parts of the property he still avoided. Like the old feeding pen where they'd learned to trust him. Like the slope near the creek where they'd sunbathed for hours. He couldn't walk past those places without feeling the ache settle in his chest. One evening, a storm brewed over the hills. Not a gentle one, but the kind that brought a bruised sky and a wind that carried the smell of rain before it fell. Ethan sat on the porch, watching the horizon darken, the air vibrating with distant thunder. The dogs lay at his feet, restless. That was when he saw movement near the fence line. At first, he thought it was the wind teasing the grass, but then something emerged. 3 shapes. Low, fluid, unmistakable. Ethan froze. The bobcats were bigger now, their shoulders broader, their coats darker with the patterns of maturity. They moved with the silent confidence of creatures who belonged to no one and nothing but the land. But it was them. He would have known them anywhere. They didn't come running. They didn't cry out. They simply stopped a few yards from the fence, watching him with unreadable eyes. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then in sudden, heavy sheets. Ethan didn't move, didn't dare blink. The storm roared, lightning cracking somewhere behind the ridge. One of them, he thought it was the smallest, though now she was nearly as tall as the others, took a step forward. Her gaze held his for a moment longer before she turned her head toward the hills. And just like that, they were gone again. 3 shadows melting into the rain. Ethan sat there long after they disappeared, rain soaking through his shirt, hair plastered to his forehead. It wasn't sadness he felt, not entirely. There was something else, something closer to understanding. They weren't meant to stay. They were never his to keep. The months they'd shared were a gift, not a promise. And though the ache would remain, so would the memory of what it meant to be trusted by something wild. That night, he walked out to the feeding pen for the first time in months. He set down a small dish of food, not because he thought they would come back for it, but because it felt right. A quiet offering to the wild. Weeks later, tracks appeared in the dirt near the fence. Fresh. 3 sets. Ethan smiled to himself. They were still out there. Still living. Still free. And in some unspoken way, they would always be his.